So at the end of the day, it took two brothers from Ohio who owned a bicycle shop to solve this problem of mechanical flight.
Kind of brings up another quality, was this absolutely relentless experimentation, iteration, and discipline. When we think of like, oh yeah, they built an airplane, they flew it, it's like there was so many, like you said, 1,000 steps, so many experiments, so many failures. They just would not give up. And that was absolutely required for this type of innovation to happen.
Welcome to the Mighty Things Podcast, Episode 3, and today we're going to be covering the Wright Brothers.
Yes, we picked the Wright Brothers because kind of in line with our series, we've been talking about inspiring characters and stories from history, and the Wright Brothers fit into that, just really famous inventors.
Absolutely, and as David mentioned, this ties in with our mission at Mighty Things, which is to get families exploring, learning, building together. And that is a lot of what the Wright Brothers did. So what we're going to do is give a really quick overview. Who were the Wright Brothers? What did they accomplish? And then we're going to go into a bit more detail. And we are following this book here, The Wright Brothers by David McCullough. We're not making all this up. This is our source. I would highly recommend it. And as I mentioned, we're going to go through kind of their lives, what they accomplished, and then we're going to talk about some takeaways.
Why don't we start at the very beginning, which is that people had been trying to fly for thousands of years.
So you think all the way back to like Leonardo da Vinci. He's in the 1480s. He was drawing pictures of flying machines that he actually had some ideas that were similar to what the Wright brothers ended up doing. But for those thousands of years, nobody was able to accomplish it. A lot of people died. And now you did have hot air balloons in there, but you weren't able to control them. You kind of just drifted with the wind. Getting closer, the early 1900s, you had Samuel Langley, who spent tens of thousands of U.S. government dollars trying to fly, and he kept crashing spectacularly. So by the time the Wright brothers come along, everybody who thinks flying is possible, they're just considered crazy.
Yeah, there were people trying, even well-respected scientists, and no one had succeeded. There were some, I think, like gliding attempts that people had made. They were really just gliding off a hill or something down. So there had been some of that. But I think, people looking up at the birds and seeing like, oh yeah, there's these creatures that are flying around. Like it seems like it's possible, but people had kind of abandoned hope that it was possible just because of all the failed attempts. And as you mentioned, the money that was spent up to that point.
So at the end of the day, it took two brothers from Ohio who owned a bicycle shop to solve this problem of mechanical flight. And one of the most amazing things is that neither of them had formal education. They didn't even go to college. They had no funding, so they were self-funded by selling bicycles. And they went from the idea of wanting to build this flying machine to actually flying powered controlled flight in just about 4 years. Throughout that time, they became really rigorous, self-taught scientists. And, they studied birds, they made wind tunnels, they collected data. It was very, very rigorous process. I would say they were borderline obsessed with it, but they definitely got the results.
Right. And we'll talk more about this at the end, but I have to say, this is an American story, right? You have the underdogs, the guys with no education or background that come from nowhere and do something that was considered impossible.
It's like the good old-fashioned American know-how. Yeah, exactly. And we'll see that in the story. Cool. So why don't we go ahead and move on then? And we're going to go more into the details now, just kind of talking through sections of their life. So we'll start kind of their early years, how they got into the problem of flying, and then, kind of the advancements they made over time.
Sounds good. We'll go through, I guess, some dates here. Wilbur was born in 1867. Orville was born in 1871, so 4 years apart. They grew up in Dayton, Ohio. Their father, Milton Wright, was an ordained minister and a strong kind of a character example for them. And so this is right, I guess, after the Civil War during the Reconstruction period. And this is also early days for Teddy Roosevelt as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. They are contemporaries of Teddy Roosevelt. He's maybe 10 years older. This is kind of the time of industrialization. So there's tons of things changing, which maybe that was, fortuitous for them, just seeing like the trains and the cars and engines and all that stuff being invented right around that same time. Electricity as well, being harnessed and used. But one of the interesting things from their childhood is they had kind of a typical childhood growing up in Ohio, but they were very mechanically oriented. They loved building things, playing with toys. And at one point, I think they were about 10 or 11, and their father brought home one of those toy helicopters that you can like spin in your hands and then they fly. So apparently those had been built as a toy, and they were just fascinated with it. And that is what Orville later said kind of sparked their interest in flying.
Yeah, didn't it say that their dad believed that toys could teach lessons to kids? So he, I guess, looked for toys that had inspiration for them. So I mean, that's something we can take away today. Is like what toys are teaching your kids, but this was the spark of inspiration for them.
Yeah, that is a really cool thought. It's like, toys are a way to keep your kids occupied and not harassing you as much, but it's also like they can have true educational value, just like those physical things that are not formally academic, but they can be really inspiring and informative. I think another interesting thing is it mentioned that a lot of times they would play with toys until they broke, and then they'd build them back better than
Yes, I
new.
remember
That's like
that.
a
Yeah.
Pixar movie, isn't it? But that's kind of like, even from a young age, they were building things and becoming kind of mechanical.
Yeah, so you can see, just at the early age that they really were interested in how things worked, taking things apart, putting them back together.
I would say Wilbur was particularly intelligent. He was also a good athlete when he was younger, and he was actually on his way to Yale. So kind of an Ivy League track there. But then there was a major sports injury. He was playing hockey or ice hockey or something like that, and his front teeth got knocked out, and it kind of sent him into a tailspin. I guess, he had the physical pain and then digestive issues, and he became depressed. And at the same time, his mom got tuberculosis and was basically dying over a period of multiple years there. And for both brothers, like they kind of became, I wouldn't say recluses, but they were at home a lot, and it definitely altered the trajectory of their lives.
Yeah, they were seemed like a very insular family. They spent a lot of time with each other. Orville and Wilbur were basically inseparable. But yeah, this was a very traumatic event. You see that they have entrepreneurial spirit kind of early on. So Orville starts a printing business while he's still in high school. And they try to publish a newspaper. The newspaper ultimately doesn't work out. They were pretty entrepreneurial. They went around, they actually raised money for people putting placements in their newspaper and trying to cover what was going on in their town. That ultimately failed. And so they kind of pivoted back to just printing for other people, printing
Like job printing.
Yep.
Yeah. I like, to your point on entrepreneurialism, I do think that shows a willingness to take risks. I think it's like one thing to get a job, and it's like your life is defined for you. I think from a very early age, they were kind of coloring outside the lines, and that kind of carries through. And as you mentioned, so late 1800s, so like 1890s, there was apparently a bicycle craze. And it reminds me of like early 2000s. You remember the Razor scooters that like everybody was obsessed with?
Yes.
Like they're still around, of course, but like everybody had to have a Razor scooter for a while there. And there was like a bicycle craze because the safety bicycle had been invented, which is where the wheels are the same size. It's basically what we know of today as a bicycle. And so everybody was buying bicycles, which means you had to have people to sell them and repair them. And so the Wright brothers got in on that and started a bicycle shop. And initially they were selling and repairing bikes, but then they actually started manufacturing their own.
Yeah, and so just a brief note, this was when the penny farthing was the bicycle. And so if you've ever seen it, it's got the giant wheel in the front and the tiny wheel in the back. It was very dangerous. People fell over and you could tip and all of that. So the bicycle was called the safety bicycle right at that point because it was a lot safer. You couldn't tip over, and it was a huge hit, which of course now we just think of it as being the bicycle. But this is right when that was happening. So they were definitely riding a trend at that time.
So there's some really cool pictures starting around this time period going forward of what the Wrights do, including the bicycles they build. So two of their product lines were called the Van Cleve and the St. Clair. But nonetheless, it would be really cool to get your hands on one of those today because like they were physically manufacturing those in their shop. The other kind of funny tidbit there is they eventually end up in a bicycle store that's like next to an undertaker. So, they would have had their shop and like people were being prepared for burial right next door, which is kind of funny. But
yeah, so they start this bicycle shop, and I think the bicycle shop is just important for a number of reasons, right? As far as for the Wright brothers. So I think one of them is, again, entrepreneurialism. They're willing to take risks. I do think that the independence of owning their own business was very important because later on when they're conducting their experiments, they're actually able to leave for extended periods of time and test things out and put other people in charge. You can imagine if they were actually working for other people, there was no way that they would have that flexibility.
Right. They were also self-funded. So all of what we're going to talk about as far as building the airplanes, they paid for with their bicycle money, which is also pretty cool.
And then I guess the last thing we'll say is like the mechanical kind of prowess or experience from building bicycles. You'll see that that's also a very important aspect of what made their airplane work.
So between 1896 and 1899, they're running their bicycle shops. Somewhere during this time, Orville gets really sick with typhoid, and he's kind of on his deathbed, but then he's recovering. And during this time, they're reading a lot, and they read about this German guy named Otto Lilienthal. And he is a glider, meaning he builds gliders and then flies them off of hills. And he is killed in the process of doing this, but he is able to fly like a few hundred feet, I guess, with very limited control. If you see pictures of these gliders, it's like kind of like a modern hang glider. He was like hanging on the bottom of these crazy contraptions. But this really got the Wrights thinking like, oh, this is a really cool problem to solve. You know, kind of going back to that toy they had, the helicopter. And so they began studying very seriously, reading about birds, reading everything they could get about gliders, you know, anything related to flight during this time.
Right. They wrote the Smithsonian requesting all of the available literature on flight. So they were definitely eating up any information they could get about the subject.
I thought that was really cool. It's like today we go on Google and we're like,
Yeah.
you know, access to all information. You think back then they had whatever was at their local library, which was probably
Very
about
little.
birds, maybe.
Yeah.
So they write this letter to the Smithsonian, and crazy enough, the Smithsonian replies and sends them a whole bunch of literature and I guess references to books that they should check out. So I thought that was actually really cool.
Yeah, all right. So they built a biplane after that, or a biplane kite, a 5-foot wingspan, and they were testing out their wing warping, which I guess talking a little bit about this, they basically watched the birds flying. They were students of actual birds, and they noticed that they would, you know, bend their wings or warp their wings to control their flight. So they were trying to test and see, like, could you reproduce that? So they built this kite thing contraption, which I guess it had wires or something that you would pull to warp the wings, and they were able to test that theory out.
And you can see right there from the beginning, they took a very iterative, like, try something, and then
Yep.
it would wreck. Like everything they built ultimately got wrecked, but like they would learn from it, and they were like, oh, this idea of warping the wings actually kind of works. Yeah, I kind of went down the rabbit hole a little bit on the wing warping thing, and it's interesting because what they wanted to do was solve the problem of gliding and controlling a glider first, because they figured if you ever had an engine failure, you would still want to be able to fly down to the ground, which means the airplane has to be controlled by itself. And so that's why they were really focused on how do you turn, how do you stay in the air before they put a motor on anything. And one of the things they innovated is basically there are 3 different directions an airplane has to control. You have nose up and down, which is pitch. You have wings up and down, which is roll. And then you have nose back and forth, which is yaw. And I guess before, like 2 of the 3 were understood by like Lilienthal, but I think one of them, and I don't remember which, I think it was actually roll, that had not been understood before. And that's what they got from watching birds. And that's kind of what they went to solve for when they started building their gliders.
So then kind of transitioning into the next section here, when they're really starting to do more testing, they identified, you know, they want to do more experiments, right? Like, hey, let's make bigger gliders. Let's try this out. And they did some research to figure out where the best place to do it would be. And, you know, they want really open areas where they can glide. They want wind because they need wind for this gliders to stay airborne. And so they identified Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, as being a good place for that. I think they wrote, was it the station there, to ask them about the conditions. I think they had just been studying charts or maps to trying to understand what the best place was, and they ended up landing on that as being a place where they wanted to go and experiment. And so I think they took the train and some other forms of transportation to get down there, and they would have to basically they built their first glider, which was large enough to carry a man. And I think they built it all there in Ohio, and they packed it all up in boxes and took it to Kitty Hawk.
Kitty Hawk in North Carolina, it's on the Outer Banks. So it's like you have the end of the main land, and then there's like water, and then you have these strips of land, which are the Outer Banks. And it's basically just sand dunes. And I guess they had lifeguard stations out there, and that's who they were talking to, like people on those lifeguard stations. And the folks in the lifeguard stations end up being really helpful as they're like building and flying over time. But it was really hard to get out there. It was very remote. There weren't like roads that you could take. And so, yeah, they took the train down there with their crates of stuff. And then they had to get on a boat, which was, I guess, a pretty crazy experience in a storm to get out there. But anyway, long story short, they end up in Kitty Hawk, and they're starting to build their gliders, which again, even then they weren't flying them first. They were like, they would connect them to wires and like launch them and like have people on the ground holding them just so they could learn one thing at a time. It's like, I think at first they were trying to figure out like wing shape, And then eventually they get a person on there, and now they're starting to work on their wing warping and things like that. So they take very much one step at a time.
This is 1900, so turn of the century. The other thing I found interesting was just they're basically advanced camping at Kitty Hawk. It's extremely remote. It's hard to even get to it. And they built their own kind of campsite, I guess. They built a little, I'm not sure, I don't think right off the bat, but eventually they ended up building like it's not a hangar, but like a shed to store their stuff.
It's a shack. It looks
A
terrible.
shack.
Yeah, we've got pictures. We'll show you.
Yeah, so they built that, but they have to do like, they build all that. They're like cooking all their own food, and then it's not really a fun place to be. There's a lot of like wind all the time, and I guess sandstorms kind of stuff, and bad weather, and they're also like the bugs and all that. So they're advanced camping while they're conducting these scientific experiments.
Yeah, one thing they mentioned specifically is mosquitoes. There was one season where the mosquitoes were just awful. It's like unbelievably bad. And so, yeah, like this was not a vacation. They were definitely toughing it out while building something that could get them killed too.
They were really determined to succeed. Yeah, the story of the mosquitoes, I think they said the mosquitoes descended on them in clouds. And I think it said the mosquitoes basically bit them through to their underwear. So they ended up hiding in their blankets, I think at night, like trying to cover up everything except, their nose. They could breathe because they're trying to escape the mosquitoes.
Man, I cannot imagine.
Sounded terrible when I read about it. Yeah.
So they keep going back and forth now between Ohio and Kitty Hawk. And so it's now 1901. Teddy Roosevelt is now president. He just becomes president, which is pretty cool. It's all contemporary. If you listen to our first podcast episode, we cover the life of Teddy Roosevelt. And one of the things they figure out pretty quickly is all of the published data on aeronautical flight, mechanical flight, wing shape, it's all wrong, like totally wrong. And so they had, I guess, information from Lilienthal, the German guy, as well as Chinook, something like
Chinook,
that,
I think.
Who was a guy who's very helpful throughout their life. But these people had written things down that were essentially, they came out to be guesses. It was inaccurate. And so their second glider was very disappointing because it was built based on this data they thought was right, and it didn't work at all. And so they were extremely disappointed. Like Wilbur said, not within 1,000 years would man ever fly. That was like one of the things, after they crashed and burned, he was like, this is never going to work.
Yeah, they had to throw out all of the sideline armchair theories that had been created up to that point.
And we were talking a little bit about this before we hit record, but it's interesting because they weren't just academics. So they were very rigorous. They read a lot. They studied. We'll talk a bit more about the data they collected. But the interesting thing about them is they were out there building. And in a speech that Wilbur gave, he kind of compared it to riding a horse. And he's like, you can read about riding a horse, but if you really want to do it, you have to get on the horse. And so they were very hands-on at every step. And that's kind of one thing that differentiated them from the other people trying.
I think when you're at the beginning of something, a breakthrough like that, you have to be hands-on because the information that's available is just not there. You're creating the first way of doing something. So that quality was, I think, essential to their success.
Right. So back in Dayton, Ohio, they're really upset after that crash and burn with their second glider. And so they devise a wind tunnel. And apparently wind tunnels have been built before, but it's essentially, think a long box, it's enclosed, and they set up a fan on one side, and they didn't have electricity in their bike shop. So it was run on a gas generator. It was super loud and noisy, but they had a fan and they were able to blow wind through. And then they would bend saw blades into different shapes. And what they were doing is collecting data on different wing shapes. So super innovative, very, very intelligent here. And they spent hours and hours and hours building different shapes, blowing wind through, testing the results. And ultimately, they use this data to then go back and redesign the glider, like recreate those data tables. And this is kind of what gave them leaps and bounds over everybody else trying to fly, is the data they collected here.
Yeah, so they used that data to improve their design. Again, this iterative design approach. And then they go back in 1902. They have a redesigned glider. And they've achieved a true 3-axis control for the first time in October the 8th. And so they made, I think, 700 to 1,000 different glides, just over and over again gliding. And this was another thing, is they felt like you needed to master flying almost as a pilot.
As a skill,
So they felt like, what I remember there was in the book, it mentioned, they had calculated the amount of time that previous people had spent in the air with the gliding experiments, and it was insignificant. Like, you added up all the different glides, which are 10 seconds each or something, and they'd spent 15 minutes in the air or something like that. And they rightly basically drew the conclusion, like, how can you learn how to fly if you're not going to be in the air for long enough? So they were trying to just rack up time in the air. That was a big goal they had.
Yeah, they kind of broke the problem down into two sides, the mechanical side and then the skill side. And I think they were very confident in their mechanical abilities, rightly so. But what they were very concerned about is, like, will we ever have the skill to respond quickly enough? And so that's why they were doing like 700 flights in a glider before trying to put an engine on the thing.
In 1903, just for some historical perspective, this is when the Ford Motor Company was founded and construction on the Panama Canal under the Roosevelt administration began.
Yeah, so basically they end up back in Kitty Hawk, and this is where they have built an engine and they put it on one of their gliders. And, they're out there, there's 5 people with them. They power the thing up and they go, and it becomes the first powered flight. And there's actually an image of it we'll show, which is pretty cool that they were able to capture that. It's actually a really epic looking image. But Orville makes this first flight. It was only 12 seconds long, and he went 120 feet. And I think the book notes that it's like, that's less than the wingspan of a modern 737. But the important thing was, it was a mechanical aircraft, heavier than air, underpowered and controlled flight. And that is what they essentially accomplished. That's what sets them apart from anything that had happened before. And they went on to make 4 flights that day. The longest was about 800 feet. So they were in the air for about a minute.
Yeah, so this is the big record breaker. I think this was the Flyer 3 was the number. Am I right, or am I getting that wrong?
The Flyer 1. So,
Flyer 1, okay.
So before we had gliders, so yeah, we had, I think, 3 gliders before. There was the 1900 glider, the 1901 glider, and the 1902 glider. The 1902 glider was the one where they achieved stability, the ability to wing warp and control flight. And then that's where in 1903, they built the Flyer 1, which is their first powered aircraft.
And so just to take a minute on this, it's the first motorized flight. So this was the big record breaking thing. And the engine that they built for it was really cool. There's a picture of it here that we'll share. But Charlie Taylor was their machinist back at the bike shop, and they built the engine. I mean, they couldn't find an engine, right, that was to their specs. Is that right?
Yeah, so they had written to a bunch of, I guess, car manufacturers asking about engines of a certain weight and power output, and hadn't gotten anything that worked. So they're like, okay, we'll build an engine. And this is like repeated, like, again, like we think about them flying and that, but it's like there were 1,000 steps between the idea and the flying, and they went one at a time and solved them. So the engine was obviously a big one. The other one was like the propeller. Like, how do you even propel yourself through the air? And they had to design that. And they initially looked at like boat propellers, but even that there was almost no data on, which is just fascinating.
Yeah, I think they realized that there were some fundamental differences between like a propeller for water versus air, and so they had built their own propeller. They made their own engine. It's just groundbreaking stuff, and it's amazing. I think the engine they built in like 6 weeks. So really impressive. And that's their bike kind of machinist skill. If you look at the engine, you see like these chains on it. It really does seem reminiscent of bicycle technology.
Probably used actual bike parts on this thing. The other thing is like the way they controlled these planes was with these wire cables. And so the pilot would essentially lay on his stomach and move his hips, and that would move a cradle that was connected to the wing warping as well as the tail. And it would control everything at the same time to give you that stability. And then they put their elevator on the front. So if you see their planes, like there's this elevator sticking out in front, and that's what makes you go up and down, which is different than how planes are done today. But again, they figured out all those different control surfaces and connected and wired them all together, again, with probably bike parts.
Yeah, and it was definitely something where you needed to learn how to use all of that and how to fly it. So they were doing repeated flights. They ended up getting eventually to more than one person, which kind of, jumping ahead here, but they always made sure that they didn't have both of them on the plane. They were concerned if there was a wreck, if take both of them out at one time. So they were very careful just to have one of them. I guess, why don't we jump ahead to when they basically finished at Kitty Hawk, and, they're iterating and improving their design, and they wanted to find a place that's closer to home. Now, I skipped over this, but they're kind of ignored at this point still, right? I mean, they basically solved it, or at least proved it could be done. and nobody even pays attention.
That's right. So they wire back after they successfully fly. They wire back like, tell the papers we did it, we flew. And at this, but yeah, they're completely ignored. Like, again, there had been so many people trying to fly even recently, and it was all considered just craziness and nonsense. So yeah, I think one other thing that comes to mind here is you mentioned like they wouldn't fly together because they wanted, if one of them got killed, the other one wanted to continue the work. I think that really struck me as they were not daredevils. I think when you think of early flyers, like with wing walking and like all the crazy stuff that went on once you did have airplanes, they were not that. They were not showmen. They were very private people. They did a lot of this secluded, like they were not looking for attention at all. And they were also avoiding any unnecessary risks. And so they knew that this was very dangerous. Lots of people had been killed trying to fly.
I remember the book talks about like every flight they do, one of them at least would go and meticulously inspect the entire machine to make sure it was working. And they did that the entire time they were flying, even later. And it was like nothing would stop them from carefully inspecting things. So they're very, very level-headed, very cool-headed, and they would just kind of meticulously do that. And like you said, they were definitely safety conscious. So they wanted to, just to make sure they weren't taking any unnecessary risks.
Basically, they get their plane flying and under control enough they can now bring it back to Ohio, and they get a cow field where they're going to continue their experiment. So it's called Huffman Prairie. It's near Ohio, and they'd basically work in their bike shop, and then any extra time they had, they'd run out to the prairie and practice flying. And they mentioned like they would time flying for when the train was not going by because they didn't want people seeing them or, spying on them or whatever. And during this time, so this is around 1904 to 1905, they build the Flyer 2 and Flyer 3, which is considered the first truly practical airplane. By 1905, they're flying 24 plus miles in a single flight, and they're able to bank and turn at will, which was their goal. And yeah, really, really actually flying as we think of it in the modern sense.
I think people are starting to pick up on the fact that this is actually doable. Like, I think the word is leaking out that there's, and I think other people are now trying to competition is trying to fly as well. So I think very soon after other people make successful flights, but they continue to kind of set the record. So, you have other people making a flight successfully, but they fly farther or they fly higher. They keep pushing the bar on like the longest flight in terms of time or in terms of distance or in terms of altitude.
It seemed like they weren't too concerned about the competition. Like, their supporters would write them about, oh, this guy's flying over here. And they'd be like, okay, but they knew they were so far ahead because of the data that they had collected. It wasn't just about building the airplane. It was all the scientific data they now had on like optimal wing shape and propeller shape and all of that. So rightly so, they weren't too concerned at that point. But for a period of like a year and a half after they were really flying, everybody ignored them. Like the U.S. Army ignored them. The U.S. government ignored them. They got some minor interest from European governments. But really what it took was them doing public demonstrations. So kind of getting to the end of what we're going to cover here is like from like 1908, 1909, they're now going around giving demo flights. And so once they do that, like people finally believe them, and you get these crowds of tens of thousands of people who'd come out to watch them fly. They end up in, Wilbur ends up in Europe, and he's doing these flights, and like the King of England comes out to watch him and all these upper crust folks over there. But one thing that really struck me is, again, even then, he was super meticulous about his flying, and he would be like, oh, the wind is too strong today, I'm not flying. And so he would be like, okay, king, go home. Maybe not literally the king, but like they stayed like very level-headed, even when they basically became world famous and world renowned. It did happen finally, but they stayed very focused on safety and just very level-headed. It's like they didn't get puffed up, if that makes sense.
They didn't. Seemed very just focused on flying. And I think when he was over in Europe, he was basically living in the shed with the plane. Part of that was probably to protect the plane from being vandalized, but or having patents stolen. But he was there, like I think taking his shower with a hose in the back. It was basically camping again. But yeah, and you have all these famous people coming out, and like you said, he was not, I think it said he treated everyone the same, basically. So he didn't really show partiality to two different people that were watching the flights.
It's kind of like going back to their Ohio upbringing. You kind of think that Midwestern, and again, it's kind of a cliche maybe, but it's like, I do think that applied to them. It was just very like, they were the everyday man, and they were just focused on their craft. I do think they were very much craftsmen as well. So like, when the Flyer was shipped over to Europe, it was destroyed in transit, basically. And so Wilbur had to rebuild it himself. And that's kind of where he was like living in the shop, but he didn't really trust anybody else to touch it. Which again, it's kind of interesting because it's like, that's not a great way to scale. And I think that's, maybe why they didn't do so well later with like manufacturing airplanes. But it's like, they were craftsmen. They like knew every bolt on the airplane, and they cared so much about it. And that definitely came through as they were, going around and giving demos and all of that.
These are the geniuses that made it happen. They weren't necessarily, I think they had business savvy, but that wasn't like maybe their first thing.
Yeah.
They were better when it came to the invention, the craftsmanship, and the mechanics. So they keep flying farther. They keep, setting new records and, eventually getting more recognition. So I think we could probably transition at this point to talking about maybe the aftermath really quickly, and then talk about what we can learn from them. I think what is kind of interesting is the Wright Flyer, the airplanes they'd invented, didn't end up being, they were used, but they weren't necessarily the biggest commercial success from what I could tell. And also they're not, you look at planes today and planes are very different.
Yeah.
Like the Wrights ended up getting really caught up in patent battles to try to protect what they had already built because people are trying to copy them. But I think the biggest value that they offered was proving it could be done. It wasn't that their specific design was used later. That's what I took from the book.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Kind of like they showed it could be done. People finally believed it. And then around that time, you have this explosion of people now trying to fly. So I think they are definitely recognized as being like groundbreakers. They were the leaders. A lot of the like wing shapes and all of that they developed were like very important. But then by like, I think it was 1915. So, just a few years later, European aviation kind of surpassed American, and they went from the wing warping, which is where you're bending the wings, to using what we use today, which is ailerons. And it's just a much better method of controlling flight. And because of that, it left the Wright Flyers largely obsolete because all their patents were around these wing warping methods. And so the world kind of advanced on and surpassed them. And so unfortunately, they spent several years there just kind of fighting patent battles instead of focusing on innovation.
Yeah.
And, unfortunately, Wilbur ends up dying at age 45, very young, 1912. I think it was typhoid again, which, man, that seems to be a recurring theme. So, yeah, his father wrote, he had a short life. It was full of consequence, an unfailing intellect.
What's interesting is, immediately the military is interested in airplanes, right? And so, of course, turning it into a weapon, weaponizing it. So, the Wrights did, Orville specifically did live long enough to see it being, the airplane being used in combat. We have World War I. I think someone asked him what he thought about that. And he basically said flight is sort of like fire. He said, fire has very good applications and bad applications, bad uses. So it's like, the airplane is a neutral thing. You can use it for good or for warfare, for evil as well. So I thought that was just an interesting statement from him, just seeing his invention being applied to various uses.
Yeah, I think that kind of touches on immediately the world was changed by flight. So whether it was the Wrights planes or others, you think 1914, World War I is kicking off, through 1918, and immediately flying is changing that. By the time you get to World War II, bombers are a significant part of warfare. And then you just have like the commercial aspect. So now you can get on an airplane and fly across the country or around the world. And in one generation, it completely changed the world. And then even soon after that, you have space flight. And it's not directly related, but it all kind of comes back to people now believe that you can fly. And that is kind of uncorking the bottle there, letting the genie out.
I want to just kind of rewind the beginning for a second to, within this 3-year period, they completely changed things when they go from, no flight to powered flight. There was a magazine writer during that time before they had achieved this that wrote, he was a distinguished astronomer who wrote in a magazine. He basically dismissed the dream of flight as a myth. And he said it has no practical purpose, even if it was achieved. So that's one of those examples of people that make really bold statements and then it looks really foolish
Just a few years later.
Yeah.
Like no practical purpose. Like,
yeah. And now, of
pretty
course,
dense.
it's integral now. So it's just amazing to think of that quote and how far they came in a few years.
So one thing I noticed that was kind of cool is like if Orville had lived to be 85 years old or so, he would have met my parents, right? He would have overlapped with them. So it's like there's a lot of generations in there, but it's like flight has not been around for that long. The person who invented flying could have met our parents, like our generation's parents. So that's pretty cool. Like it has not been that long. And the world has changed so much in that time, like since the early 1900s to where we are today. Is just really amazing. It feels like it's always been this way, or it's, I guess it's easy to take for granted what we have, but a lot of the technology we have is actually very new.
Yeah, and it is amazing to think in, basically 65-ish years between the invention of the airplane, like that's when we actually put a man on the moon.
Right.
So the progression of air travel between that time period.
That's crazy. Maybe we just take a few minutes to talk about takeaways, kind of things that we learned or observed from this whole story.
Yeah, that sounds good. Really, we've touched on this a bit, but these guys beat the professionals. Like, this is an American story. They were basically nobodies and they beat the professionals. And it's this emphasis on practical experimentation, not theory. I think this really separates the cliche of like academics from people that are innovators or inventors, is the ability to actually put something into practice or experiment in the real world. I would say in a similar way, we should strive for similar values. Don't just stay in the books, right? Go and try things and not necessarily invent things unless you're an inventor, but just the value of taking things from the realm of theory into the realm of practice, right? Theory is obviously helpful, but in the end, it can be fiction. It has to be proved out in practice.
And closely dovetailed with that is kind of the self-education aspect. It's like, yeah, they weren't professionals. They didn't have engineering backgrounds per se, but they were self-taught. They were educated in the sense that they got the books, they studied what was available, they watched the birds. And what was really interesting to me is this is actually a theme across the podcasts that we've done. Like Teddy Roosevelt was largely self-educated. Lewis and Clark, or Lewis specifically, was self-educated on botany. And then you get to the Wright brothers, and again, it's not the engineers from Harvard or any of the Ivy League schools. It's these bicycle mechanics who go out and they educate themselves. And I think that is really, really interesting that this is not by accident. I think people who have to color outside the lines, and again, we talked about them being entrepreneurial as well. It's like they were coloring outside the lines when it came to work, when it came to their life. And then when it came to invention, they also kind of threw aside all the things that had been done before. They realized it was not good enough. And then they went out and they taught themselves how to do it better. And I just thought that was really cool.
Yeah, I thought that was good. And that kind of brings up another quality, was this, absolutely relentless kind of experimentation, iteration, and discipline. Again, when we think of like, oh yeah, they built an airplane, they flew it, it's like there was so many, like you said, 1,000 steps, so many experiments, so many failures. This is the cliche of you have to accept failure, you have to be determined and tenacious. Like they absolutely like epitomize this. I think it was kind of obsession in a way. But they really did demonstrate this. And I think it was inspiring to think about, we just give up and like, oh yeah, we'll do something a few times and like, we'll just give up. But they just would not give up. And that was absolutely required for this type of innovation to happen.
Yeah, the cool thing is with their gliders, this could have been done thousands of years before, because it was literally wood that was cut out with fabric wrapped over it. And then they used wire, which, I guess you could have used rope or something. So it's like flying machines could have been built for most of history with the technology that was available. They weren't using anything special. They figured that out, again, by that just discipline, not giving up, collecting data, kind of applying the scientific process to it. And then once they got the thing flying, they stuck an engine on it. Again, solving a million problems there. Mm-hmm. But it's like, this is something that could have been done by many, many people, for thousands of years, but it wasn't. It took them in that process, that specific process, and they were able to accomplish it, which is pretty cool.
I think it is pretty cool. I mean, I think you also see that this was done by a few individuals. It was not done by an organization. And I think that tight loop between they had the vision, they had the drive, they did the things that needed to be done, they experimented, and they just did those iterations, right? They were able to achieve it. And I think you just see this famous inventors are often individuals. Like the organization can kind of operationalize something, but it requires the individuals to actually prove that it's possible.
It's like the forward thinkers. Yep. It's like you have to think outside the box to make that next step. And then once the world is there, then it's like the process can be built around that in a way.
You want to talk about their personality for a bit?
Yeah, sounds good. Very interesting.
They seemed eccentric. What did you think?
Yeah, we were talking a bit about this, and at first I said maybe academic, because they were almost shut-ins, and maybe that came from the health issues early on, but it's like, these brothers living together for their entire lives, basically. I don't know. They just felt very odd and very
Mhm.
intelligent, but also just almost antisocial in a way. Maybe that's not fair. We don't know them, but yeah, it definitely came across as a bit odd.
Yeah, I think it talked about their tremendous industriousness, like their whole family in them from an early age. Like they would just work and work and work and work. They'd be at the bicycle shop working. So it was kind of like their drug. They just enjoyed working all the time. They were not out socializing and partying. So they were probably, very much oriented towards things, not people. I mean, I think that's definitely true.
Yeah, I think there was a quote
Yeah.
on that. I think Wilbur said,
Yeah.
you may remember this, but it was something like mechanical problems are easy to solve. It's the people that you have to watch
Yes.
out for, basically.
He said that, yeah, things are easier than people.
That's it.
I think that was during the time they were fighting all the patent battles, and they really just wanted to invent and to do things. So they were, I think, extreme doers. And they were, definitely seem very methodical. And, I think of like not watchmakers, but, bicycle mechanics, like this was kind of their personality. And so, they were not showmen at all. And they just kind of wanted to do their work. I think they were very dedicated to their work.
Yeah, and on the positive side, like we already hinted at this, but they did remain very humble and focused. So they were giving these demos in front of tens of thousands of people, King of England. And again, like if it was unsafe to fly, they would not fly. It was like very process oriented. They stayed humble. And I think even flying today, one of the most dangerous things is you get in this attitude where it's like, oh, I just got to get there. I've got to, just kind of skipping the processes and the safety steps. And they did not do that. They had a very much like, this is what we're going to do. And they stuck with it. So I think that was on the positive side for them. It kept them alive when many other people, even contemporaries of them, got killed flying. Yeah, one other thing I wanted to talk about is like the patent battles. So we didn't cover this in detail, but like after they're flying, they're famous. They spent the rest of, their lives basically fighting patent battles. And I think my takeaway from that was like, do what you're good at, because time is so precious. And Wilbur ends up dying very young. And it's like, if he had known that he was going to die in a few years, would he have spent his time on that? And it felt like a waste to me. So I think there's almost a cautionary tale there where it's like, what is your gift? And focus on that. Don't get distracted from that, but also realize your time is limited. So it's like, even when you feel like somebody's infringing on your rights, maybe it's not the best use of your life to chase them down.
Yeah, I agree. I kind of, you're reading the story and you're kind of hoping they'll keep innovating, but they ended up just getting tied up in preserving what they had already made. So that was maybe a disappointing element.
For sure.
So yeah, I think though a lot of the other qualities they have are definitely worth, in our own way replicating and kind of being inspired by. I think just, the underdog winning is such a great American story. They didn't use the excuse of not having the education or having the resources. Those were, they just remained dedicated and they were able to have obviously a tremendous impact through the work that they did.
I think the last thing I'll say is like when we think about raising kids and like how do we help our kids kind of fulfill their potential. And I think all the way back to like the toys that they were playing with, the Wrights were playing with, and that had a direct impact on the future of their lives. And so when we're thinking about our kids and the things that we buy them, the things that we give them, it's like, is this building them up towards what they could be?
Mm-hmm.
Or is this just wasting their time and occupying their minds? And I think, video games definitely come to mind. I'm not completely against video games, but it's like, there are so many things that we spend time on, even movies, that they occupy our minds, but they don't better us. They don't make us progress or get better or learn. But then there are things that we do, like, certain toys you might think of, like going outside and building something or even getting a hammer and just doing something in the garage where it's like, yeah, it doesn't seem like much. It's very simple, the things that we do, but it's like that could unlock something in that kid that allows them to then go forward and do something with their lives. So I just, that really struck me. I think like that inspiration for flying came from when they were kids with the toys they were playing with.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think if you look at the Wright Flyer and it looks like a DIY airplane. I mean, that is what it is. And I think it's inspiring to, show your kids that airplane and just say, somebody made that. And they, it was literally a craftsman made that airplane. It was not made in a factory. There was no directions on how to make it, and somebody made it. And I think that's inspiring. We live in a very modern world now where everything is, engineered, to the nines. You have computer systems and simulations and you have so many experts work on everything. I think you kind of forget those times where it's like the first version of this was just made by someone, and that, being able to make something with your own hands and is still
Right.
still worthy, and it's still worth being reminded of that today.
Yeah, I think that's it. It's like technology is not bad. We're not saying that, but it's kind of like, don't forget where all of this comes from. And it starts with somebody in their garage with an idea, and that somebody needs the capability. So that's kind of where we start from.
Well, I think that's a great way to wrap it up. So this is a really fun story to read through. I hope everyone enjoyed listening to it on the podcast, and definitely pick up the Wright Brothers by David McCullough if you haven't already. It's worth diving into deeper.
For sure. All right. Thank you. We'll see you on the next episode.
Next time.